little over a year ago, I purchased call it digital camera of my dreams. At least that's what I thought at the time. And it was the perfect hybrid of my love for the analog process mixed with the convenience and the speed of a digital workflow. And for those who missed the title, I am talking about the Leica M9. At the time I bought it, this camera was only 11 years old, but now it's quickly approaching its 13th birthday. 13 years, 156 months, a little under 5,000 days of improvement in the digital camera technology world, and towing the other side of that line, this guy right here. So what about it? This soon to be 13-year-old digital relic. Does it hold up? Do I regret the purchase? Or maybe the better question is, should anyone buy this camera? So let's just dive right in. First, I want to cover the features, so you'll have some context, even if you're not entirely familiar with the camera itself. As far as how these features stack up against modern cameras, we'll get to that a bit later in the video, but let's just focus on features right now. So the M9 is made up of titanium. It weighs a little over a pound. It feels like a brick. It's a rangefinder style camera with a 35mm full-frame CCD sensor developed by Kodak to resemble Kodachrome film. It's Leica's second M to be released as a digital camera, following the still highly regarded M8. And many fans say that Leica used the M8 to work out any kinks, and this camera was the result of that refinement process. At the time of its release, it was heralded as the perfect digital rangefinder. Its sensor is 18.5 megapixels. Its rear LCD screen is straight out of 2009, aka awful. It offers a fantastic optical viewfinder, supports all M-mount lenses, no autofocus, aperture priority if you want it. I've never used it, so I can't really speak about it one way or another. Auto ISO, again, never really used it, but you should be aware that the ISO only goes up to 2500. And even then, I probably wouldn't shoot it past 16, which that's about 5 to 10 stops lower than some modern offerings. Max storage is 16 gigabytes, only takes SD cards with speeds below 90 megabits per second, will not shoot video, has no live view capabilities, and it's currently selling from anywhere between $3,000 to $5,000 depending on the condition of the camera. Of course, lens not included. You should also know if you buy a model that hasn't had its original CCD sensor replaced with a newer corrosion resistant version, you could be setting yourself up for some trouble. So Now that all that's out of the way, who is this camera for? Well, ironically enough, the person who would probably be the perfect fit for this camera doesn't exist anymore. Someone who has spent a considerable amount of time shooting with a rangefinder Leica, film Leica, maybe an M5, M6, or an M7, who loves shooting Kodak color slide film, and who's looking to move into a digital workflow. That was a very, very real customer base in 2009, but it's since come and gone. So with that taken into account, let's try to put together a modern day customer profile. I'd say you're looking at someone who's used to shooting with a rangefinder system, someone who shoots film, understands how film works, and is looking to mimic aspects of that workflow digitally. Someone who appreciates quality, who appreciates simplicity, although these are somewhat subjective to the user. Also, someone who shoots more documentary or journalistic work than anything else, and who won't need to use the camera in a commercial professional setting or for video. And preferably someone who already owns a film Leica and some M lenses. And maybe you started on an M6 or M7, like I was saying. This camera could be perfect. It could be the perfect evolution or the perfect digital complement. I'll explain what led me to buy it, and hopefully that kind of sheds some more light on why you would choose this. But yeah. So I bought this camera because I couldn't get what I wanted with anything else. At the time, it wasn't the most responsible purchase I'd ever made, but it had been a couple of years in the making, and when sorting through all of the options, the M9 really did make the most sense. It was the perfect fit. At the time, I owned a Fuji X Pro 3, a quasi-digital rangefinder that had a slew of features and was apparently geared towards a very similar customer profile to the one I described above. I started my relationship with photography shooting a digital camera, more specifically a Canon DSLR, a T6i. And for the first year or so, I used that camera and worked in a fully digital process. So I'd, shoot, Lightroom, etc. After a couple of years, I bought a film camera and began learning the process of analog photography. Through that time, I shot less and less digital, but would get behind on film processing. I couldn't afford to use labs at that point. I was still in school, and this would lead to frustration, film piling up, and eventually me not shooting at all. It took a little time, but eventually I got fed up enough with sitting around and letting undeveloped film pile up that I began looking for a digital camera that could offer a similar experience to film, ideally the best of both worlds. My thought process on this has changed a little bit, but I'm not going to get into that right here. To clarify though, the film experience I'm referring to is manual exposure, zone focusing, less processing, or that's what I thought at the time. That feeling of being entirely present with your subject, et cetera, et cetera. For me, my personal work, that's what makes me feel connected to the craft. It makes me feel connected to the photographers who've inspired me in the past, and that's why I like that workflow. So anyways, I'm trying to find a digital camera that scratches that itch. Eventually, I come across the X100. And at this point, Leica wasn't even a word in my vocabulary. Not a chance. So I started digging into the X100. I decided it could be the perfect solution to my digital film problem. And after a month or two of plasma donations, I'm kidding, I bought the camera. At first, it was awesome. And then after a few weeks, I came to realize it wasn't really the solution to my problem. It was still too modern. Although it was better than the DSLR, it still felt like a digital camera. And I was in the scenario of, well, I can't justify owning this Fuji and a DSLR, which is more functional, especially when it comes to work. So I ended up selling the X100. Fast forward a bit, a couple of years, 2019, I'm still looking to scratch that itch. I had a super busy year with client work and life in general. So my lack of shooting personal work wasn't really bothering me a ton. But I eventually moved to Omaha and my client work kind of took a dive. And all of a sudden, I wasn't shooting, period. And after a couple of months of this, I started to kind of lose my mind and I started searching again. And this time Leica was on my radar. Still out of my price range, but on my radar. But the price range won out. I settled on the X Pro 3, hoping that they'd fix some of the kinks or the problems that I had with the X100. And that this would now be the perfect film digital hybrid. There's also the fact that I wasn't entirely sure what the photography side of my client work would end up looking like. So buying a new Fuji that had video, et cetera, seemed like the more responsible decision. I'll admit I love that camera, but there were always things I disliked about it from day one. And I have a couple of videos from a couple of years ago where I talk about some of those things if you're interested. So anyways, fast forward a bit and I'm fed up with the X Pro 3. My professional work had shifted more to the film production side of things. So my relationship with photography was becoming increasingly more personal. And the style of work that I enjoyed most was in the documentary tradition. So I wanted something small and portable, but also manual. I wanted something that I could learn and then forget about eventually. If I missed the shot, it's my fault. It's not the camera's fault. And in that vein, I also had this dream of a camera that could use the same lenses for both a film and a digital setup. Just one less thing to worry about. The money was kind of right to make the switch, so I did. My options at the time were an M240, an M8, and an M10. I didn't like the extra buttons and things like that on the M240, and the CMOS sensor wasn't my favorite, in my opinion. The M8 was crop sensor, had its own slew of issues, and the M10 was essentially a more expensive M9. At least that's what the conclusion I came to. Higher ISO, sure, more megapixels, but it also had the CMOS sensor, which I didn't love as much as the CCD. And I'll circle back to this idea as I do have some new thoughts. But anyways, I went with the M9. To me, the M9 was this beautiful mechanical photographic tool. It didn't have any unnecessary features. It offered everything I'd wanted in a photography camera and nothing I didn't care for. It was released kind of before digital cameras knew what they could do yet. I found this on an online listing from the Leica store in Nuremberg. I had a replaced sensor, recent CLA. It was perfect. I immediately bought a 35mm Zeiss lens, and the rest was history. And I'm sure we've all had something that, we've held in high regard, and then we finally get it, and it doesn't live up to our expectations. And I'm happy to report that this wasn't one of those situations. I'm absolutely in love with this camera. I was the moment I took it out of the box. It's just amazing to this day. It's my second favorite camera I've ever owned, probably behind my M4. It's got a permanent spot on my shelf, and I've made some photos with it that I'll treasure for the rest of my life. So now, full disclosure, I've not owned or shot extensively with an M10 or an M11. Can't compare those cameras to this, but as far as anything else goes, this camera feels just absolutely perfect to me. The photos are beautiful. The size is perfect for me. The lenses switch back and forth on my M4. I can go down the Summicron rabbit hole whenever I want. It just works. It's the closest I've come to that film experience with digital, and nothing else is really in the ballpark. I've never missed a shot because of the camera. I've only missed shots because I suck. And for me, the work I like to do, that's a beautiful thing. So put briefly, if you're looking for a digital camera with, for lack of better phrasing, the soul of a 35mm film camera, I really think this could be the perfect solution. Now let's move on to talk about who should not buy this camera. If you're new to photography, this might not be a great camera for you. I could make an argument for the other side, but for the most part, when you're learning, I think the best move is usually to get some easy wins, not put yourself too much in a corner. You're still discovering your voice. You're having easy to use tool with a broader set of capabilities is probably better for that discovery process. This camera is incredibly simple to use. It's easy to use, easy to understand, but at the same time, it'd be very difficult for someone still trying to learn the basics of photography, like exposure and things like that. And you might be a person who likes to jump in the deep end, but for most people, I think this is just going to lead to getting discouraged, and it's also really expensive and doesn't do anything other than take photos. So if you're just feeling out the craft and you're in the early stages, I don't think it's worth it. If you currently shoot with a Nikon, Canon, or Sony, and really love the automatic features that those cameras offer, and I'm not dogging on those. I'm literally like filming the video on a Sony. I shoot commercial work with a Sony, whatever. But if you like the automatic experience of those cameras, especially autofocus, then this is probably not the best camera for you. The only things that have automatic options on this are white balance and shutter speed. And honestly, I'd recommend setting both of those manually because, in my opinion, it's going to give you more consistent results. If you like to shoot JPEGs because of the work that it takes away from the post process, probably not for you again. This takes beautiful JPEGs, but I'd only use it that way for very, very specific situations. And even then, I'm probably still shooting redundant DNGs just in case. There's no reason to lose the data. Film is much more robust than digital, especially 13-year-old digital. And shooting JPEG on this camera is like getting your film developed at Walgreens and then having the negatives tossed out before you've even seen the photos. It's just, it's not worth it. And I'd recommend putting a little bit of time into learning a digital workflow, and then you'll be good. And honestly, the JPEGs that I have shot on this, I regret not having the DNGs. So the couple of times I have shot JPEG, I do regret not having the DNG files. So just something to think about. Okay, so we've talked about who it's for, who it's not for. Now let's talk about using the camera professionally. For most pro use cases, I'd say don't even think about trying it. Unless it's specifically for documentary work, documentary style work, then yeah, I wouldn't try it. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but I wouldn't even think about using it for 99% of commercial shoots, and anything where I didn't have full confidence in my ability to control the situation, I'd probably skip it out of respect for the client. Photographic skill is one thing, and this camera can make just about any photo that a film Leica could make, and then some. And yes, plenty of professionals, shot all of their work on those film Leicas. But it's 2022. If a client's paying you a lot of money to do something specific, i.e. not your own artistic, flavor, your own artistic choices, then you need to choose a tool that allows you to do that as easily and efficiently as possible. And I don't think this is the tool, even if you've kind of mastered the camera. A quick example, I've used this for several photojournalism assignments without any problems. It's amazing. I wouldn't use anything else for that. But there are those assignments, or there are those jobs where you're hired, maybe it's for an agency or whatever, and you have to take photos in, let's say, a large dark space, 10-hour days, multiple locations, several talent. Creative director needs to monitor the photos. Makeup artist needs the ability to monitor and make adjustments. You've got assistants, you've got a remote client, you're using multiple strobes, you're working at 2.0, 2.8 because the client wants shallow depth of field. We're on a strict schedule, non-negotiable because you've got a flight out the next morning. That's how a lot of commercial jobs look. And if I try to do a shoot like that on this camera, it would be a shit show, at least for me. When I'm working with a talent with shallow depth of field, creative director, assistants, clients who don't care about my artistic intentions if the photos don't turn out and they don't have anything usable, yeah, it doesn't really matter. I prefer to let the camera handle the difficult stuff so my attention can go elsewhere. It's just not the right tool for the job. However, if I'm on the street, I'm weaving through people, come across a moment in time that's going to be gone in a thousandth of a second, there's no tool I'd rather have than my Leica. No question about it. Leica all day. If I'm running errands, want to just have a camera on me, Leica. Point I'm trying to get across is you need to know what you need out of your tool and then purchase accordingly. And while we're on the topic of limitations, this is actually a good time to discuss my philosophy on the limitations of the camera. I mentioned before, but this camera can do just about everything a film Leica could do, and then some. Just think about the photos that were taken on film Leicas, and then you'll get an idea of its capabilities. If your goal is to take great photos, this will do that for you. Quality is superb. Marketing talk is fun. More megapixels, this feature, that feature, video hybrid, blah, blah, blah. But brass tacks, no camera is going to take great photos for you. That's up to you. And this camera will take great photos if you are able to take great photos. Taking into account the best tool for the job argument, there's been over 100 years of photography using cameras that are less capable than this one. 100 years of great photography, right? You know, for most situations, I don't think the last 13 years are going to make or break anything. It's got a low ISO. Well, 1600 is the most I'd push film. Usually I shoot film at 800, or I usually shoot 800 at 400 anyways. So this will handle 1600 fine. You can even get a couple more stops out of it if you push in post, because the files are so robust. And if you think about it, 35 millimeter film doesn't look great when shot at 6400 anyways. So while these aren't silky smooth, they're more than usable. Low megapixels, you'll never really need more than 18.5 megapixels. I've never had an issue with it. Unless you're working for high-end advertising or like buildings, fashion shooting or something, which you're probably not gonna be using this camera anyways, but it's not gonna get in the way. You also don't get that clinical look that these 50 to 100 megapixel cameras that squeeze that image onto a 35 sensor, they look clinical to me. You're not gonna get that with this camera. All manual, well, learn it and you'll never have to worry about not knowing it. If you're doing work at a certain level, it's my opinion that you kind of need to know how manual photography works anyways. Even if you don't have to use those skills directly, that's your responsibility as a professional to know how that works. Shitty screen, yeah, it's awful. It's almost unusable. But the menu system is so simple that you don't need to spend much time on the screen anyways. You can check focus, composition, kind of get exposure. It's not instant, but personally, I've gotten into the habit of ignoring the screen, and I kind of like that better because it just keeps me in the moment, which is really why I wanted the camera in the first place. The buffer, it can be annoying, but it's never been an issue I've encountered out on the street. I did encounter it during like a fashion shoot one time. It was mildly annoying, but it was fine. I also enjoy the fact that I don't have to change the film every 36 frames because sure enough, every time that I'm changing my film, I miss the best scenarios, right? So that's the unspoken law of photography. I guess you don't really have to worry about that with this camera. What I love about the M9 is how perfectly light it is, how incredible it looks and feels when you hold it in your hand. It inspires me to shoot more. The photos are absolutely beautiful and it transitions seamlessly with my M4. I like how the shutter sounds. Some people might not. But most of all, I like how it gets out of the way. It completely gets out of the way. I've never had an issue with not being in the right mode or having a random setting turned on that I can't turn off. It's just simple. It's always there and it responds accordingly. Battery life is great. I picked up 2 batteries, more than enough for a day of shooting. I have a third that stays at home. Just think of them like rolls of film. I've never shot an SD card. So you're shooting 16 gigabytes, but I've never filled one up. So I wouldn't really worry about that. It's a stroke of magic in my opinion. And if you happen to be somebody who fits its unique use case buyer description, I don't think you're going to find a better option no matter really how hard you look. I recommend trying one out. And if it speaks to you, then good luck escaping its call. So that's just my thoughts on this beautiful camera. I'm sure I'll have more videos talking about this, but I don't really want to get too much into specs or, pixel peeping or anything like that. I'll just let the photos kind of speak. But anyways, if you're not subscribed, please consider doing that. If you feel like you got some value out of this video, then yeah, shoot me a thumbs up. And I'm excited to be back, and hope everybody's doing well as always, and I'll talk to you soon.